Every single state in the US has had at least one serial killer. I think this is part 16 or 17 of the series. This is a map of all the states I've covered so far. If they're marked off in red, that means I've already covered them. And if you're new here, you can go binge watch all of those states in the series if you would like. And in today's part of the series, I'm going to be telling you guys about the most notorious serial killer in New Hampshire. And this one is especially scary because it's another unsolved serial killer. And to me, anything that's unsolved just gets like 10 times more horrifying, because that means that whoever this person is or was could just be roaming around the world like normal, and we would have no idea. Like, you could walk past this person in the store and not know it, and that's absolutely terrifying. So today I'm going to tell you guys about the Connecticut River Valley Killer. And the Connecticut River Valley is basically the river and valley that runs in between Vermont and New Hampshire. It's basically what makes the state's border, and then it runs into Massachusetts and then all the way to Connecticut. And most of what happens is in New Hampshire, but the serial killer did cross the state lines or cross the river to kind of throw off police. So this story starts on September 19th of 1985. The remains of a woman were found in Newport, New Hampshire, near Sugar River in a wooded area, like right next to this little river. And Sugar River is a little branch off of the Connecticut River that we are talking about. So the autopsy of this woman concluded that the woman had suffered from multiple stab wounds, but due to the state of her remains, they'd been there for a while. They could not establish like a full cause of death. It seemed like it was likely homicide, but they couldn't like officially establish it was. Eventually though, they did learn that not only was she stabbed, there's also evidence of SA, and so once they discover this, they are pretty confident that it was homicide. At the time, they had no leads, they had no suspects, there's very little evidence. The forensic science in this time was not as good as it is today. They did not really have a lot of information, and so they kind of just thought this was like a standalone crime at this time. 7 months later, on April 15th of 1986, a woman named Linda Moore, she was 36 years old, was at home alone in her house in Westminster, Vermont. So just over the state border across the river, essentially. So Linda was a mom of 2 kids. And again, the kids were not home at the time. Linda's home alone. And we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that she had been doing yard work outside. And then that afternoon, her husband returned home and found her dead in their living room. There was no sign of forced entry in their home. And it didn't look like it was some robbery gone wrong or anything like that. Nothing was stolen. But the entire house was in disarray. It looked like there had been like a really intense fight. And they discovered that Linda had been stabbed 25 different times. And so it's clear she fought really hard. And once again, at this time, this was viewed as a standalone event. They thought maybe this was a random attack. They had no idea at that time that this was going to later be linked to a serial killer. They did ask the neighbors if anyone saw anything, if there are any witnesses, and a couple different neighbors did say like they thought that they had seen this guy, probably about 20 to 25 years old, carrying like a blue knapsack, and he kind of seemed to be lingering around Linda's house. And so some people thought that was suspicious and no one really recognized him. He wasn't someone from the neighborhood. So the police kind of think maybe this is a suspect in Linda's case. Again, they don't know it's linked to anything else at this point. It sounds like they were able to track this guy down and rule him out eventually. And so unfortunately, other than that lead that ended up not being anything, they don't have any sort of options. They don't have any sort of leads or knowledge of who could have done this. And unfortunately, this case seems like it's going to go cold as well. 4 days later, though, on April 19th, remains were found again near Sugar River in Newport, New Hampshire. And once again, the remains showed signs of being stabbed. And then 6 days later, on the 25th, another set of remains were found, and they were found less than 1,000 feet from where the first body had been found the previous year. So now they have 3 different bodies, all with very similar MOs. They all have stab wounds, and it seems like it's a homicide. And they were all dumped along the river, and again, just very similar patterns. So now they're worried that they have a repeat offender and maybe even a serial killer on their hands. And I don't know if they connected Linda's attack to this at this point or if it was a little while later, but we know that all 3 women that were found dumped along the river and Linda are connected to the same serial killer. This is when investigators in 1986 first discovered that they might have a serial killer on their hands, and they don't know how long he's been operating. They don't really know anything about it. They've just found these bodies, so clearly he's been operating for a little bit. And that's really scary, and they're very worried he's going to strike again. Obviously, immediately they start to investigate this pretty heavily. So they start to look back over the years to try to see if there's any other victims that could be linked to the serial killer, because they found 3 bodies, but it's unlikely they were the first 3 victims. So they decide to go back and look at all the unsolved stabbings, all the unsolved crime, anything that might be linked. They go back and look, and they end up discovering quite a few victims that they think are linked to this from before 1968. The first victim that they find was a woman named Catherine Milliken, and they learned that on October of 1978, she was 26 years old. She had gone to Chandler Brook Wetland Preserve in New London. She had gone there to take photos of birds, and we know that on October 24th, she was attacked and killed, and she was more than 20 times and left basically right next to where she had been taking photos. Her death and the way she was killed very much fit the MO of the other and she's the earliest confirmed victim of the serial killer. And this is 7 or 8 years before they had found the first victim's body. So they're like, this guy has probably been operating for a long time. And that's, again, very scary. So they decide to look back even farther and see if there's anyone else that possibly could be linked. And they discover that on June 11th of 1968, so 20 years before, a 15-year-old named Joanne Dunham was walking from her home. She was trying to get to the bus stop, and she was in Charlestown, New Hampshire. And we know she left her house sometime around 7:10 a.m. and then she was going to school. But that night after school, she never made it home. And obviously her family was very concerned, and they go looking for her, and unfortunately her body was found the next day on a dirt road called Quaker City Road in New Hampshire. And at the time they didn't know that this was the works of a serial killer. This case also went unsolved. It was a cold case, and the autopsy revealed that she had been asphyxiated. And they believe that she is the first victim of this serial killer, but they never had enough evidence to fully officially confirm that. So Catherine is the first confirmed victim of the serial killer, but it's suspected that Joanne was actually his first. They just can't officially say that. They discover even more victims. They learned that on July 25th of 1981, so 3 years after Catherine was killed, another woman named Mary Elizabeth Crickley was last seen being dropped off near exit 13 of the Massachusetts Turnpike, and she was taking classes at the University of Vermont. So they think she was hitchhiking from Massachusetts back to her university in Vermont, and she went missing somewhere on her trip. She never made it back to her university, and 2 weeks later on August 9th, her body was discovered in the woods off of Unity Stage Road. And this is the same area that other victims had been found. She was another case where they were inconclusive as to the exact cause of death. The ME said that it was very suspicious, and we now know that she was murdered by this guy as well. Just over a year later, on October 5th of 1982, a 76-year-old woman named Sylvia Gray was bludgeoned and stabbed to death. This was near her house in Plainfield, New Hampshire, and this is kind of in the area of the river as well. Her family had reported her missing the day before, and then they unfortunately found her in the woods. And she has never been officially confirmed to be a victim of the serial killer, but it's pretty strongly assumed that she was. The biggest cause for doubt is her age, because we're going to learn that most of his victims were really young females, and then there's this older woman who was in her 70s, and serial killers don't always deviate that much from the typical targeted age group. And so there is some question if she was actually one of his victims, but he could have just ran into her on accident. She could have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he wasn't planning on killing her, but he did because she saw something. We don't know, but it is pretty likely that she was a victim of the serial killer as well. 2 years later, on May 30th of 1984, Bernice Courtmanche was 17, and she was a nurse's aide, and she also was believed to be hitchhiking at the time, and she was last seen at 3:30 p.m. on that day and then never showed up to her destination. She was reported missing the next day, and the police realized as they are looking into Bernice's case that Bernice was actually one of the 3 women found at the river originally. So the 3 sets of remains, they were able to match one of them to Bernice. She was the one who was discovered on April 19th near Sugar River, so the second body found. They also learned that on July 22nd of 1984, a 26-year-old girl named Ellen Ruth Fried had gone missing in Claremont. She had last been seen using a payphone outside of a store and then was never seen again. And then a year later, on July 10th of 1985, a 27-year-old girl named Eva Morse was last seen hitchhiking, once again, another hitchhiker, and she was last seen hitchhiking in North Charlestown, and that's another place that he's already struck, and she also goes missing. And the police discover Ellen and Eva were the other 2 women that were found at the river. Ellen's remains were the first remains found near Sugar River in Newport, and Eva was the 3rd body that was found near West Unity. And at this point, when we're back at 1986 and the police are realizing all of this and realizing they have a serial killer, there's a panic in the area. This is a really scary thing. There's been someone targeting young women and just women in general for quite some time, completely undetected. He did cross state lines and he was in different jurisdictions, but that's still really scary that he's done this multiple times and we had no idea. As the police are continuing to look into this and the public is becoming more informed on the fact that there's a serial killer now, they discover that in 1984, a girl named Heidi Lee Martin, who was 16, had vanished on May 20th. So this was 2 years before they had discovered any of this was going on. She had gone for a jog in Heartland, Vermont, and never returned, and her body was discovered behind an elementary school in a swamp, and she had been stabbed to death as well. And at the time, someone else had confessed to her murder, but he ended up taking it back and he got acquitted. And the police weren't sure if she was connected. They had their eye on this case, but 3 years after her death, so a year into their investigation into this, another confirmed victim of the serial killer was discovered right next to where she was dumped, and so everyone thinks she was a victim as well, and I'll get into the other person that they found in a few minutes. So that is everyone that they found connected to this case before 1986, and it's clear that this person is a very violent, angry offender who is probably not going to be stopping anytime soon. So unfortunately, the only way that they feel like they're going to catch this guy is if he's strikes again. And that's really sad and scary, and unfortunately he does strike again. So on July 15th of 1986, as they are actively looking at this case and going back in time and looking at everyone, this is when everything is ramping up. A 38-year-old man named Stephen Hill was stabbed to death in Heartland, which is directly across the river from where Sylvia Gray's body was found 4 years earlier. And again, there's some debate if he was truly a victim because we don't know who this guy is. We don't know like who the serial killer is. We can't interview him. We can't like ask him to confirm or deny any of his victims. And not that every serial killer tells the truth, but sometimes that is what helps us to know who has killed what victims. And so we are not able to confirm 100% that Stephen Hill was one of his victims, but it does seem likely. The biggest reason that they think he might not be is just a deviation in MO. He's the only man that we know of that was likely killed by this guy. That following spring, on March 28th of 1987, some people are hiking in Vermont and they discover a body while they are on their hike. And this was in Heartland, which is again an area that they have already discovered other victims. And the victim was another woman. According to the ME, she was stabbed to death, and they are able to identify her as Barbara Agnew, and she was 29 years old, and she had gone missing back in January of that year. She had last been seen on January 10th, and her husband officially reported her missing 4 days later when he didn't hear anything from her. And after she was reported missing, they discovered her car. It was abandoned, and investigators believed that foul play had been a part of her disappearance because of the state of the car. But they never found her. They didn't have a body, so they weren't able to say what had happened to her until her body was found in March. And they realized that her case fit the MO of the serial killer. She was another victim of his as well. And so the public is obviously really scared because not only has this guy been operating for a while, he's still operating, and the police seem to be no closer to catching this guy. There's basically no DNA or forensic evidence to help them in the case. And it seems like no matter how much evidence they have, no matter how many people die or new like bodies and crime scenes show up, they are no closer to catching this killer, and that's really, really terrifying. Over a year later, on August 6th of 1988, everyone is still really terrified. A 22-year-old pregnant woman named Jane Borowski is headed home from the county fair, and she ends up stopping at a vending machine near a gas station in Swansea, New Hampshire. And again, she's pregnant. She's 7 months pregnant, so she's very far along at this point. And she parks and is approached by a man who asks if the payphone near her is working. And before she can say anything, he just immediately grabs her and 27 different times. And then he takes off and leaves her for dead. And she's an incredible, determined woman. She is so incredibly strong because somehow she manages to survive. She crawls to her car, gets inside, and drives to her house. And she talks about how she was worried he was following her, how he probably knew where she lived, like she was very terrified. But she ended up getting help and getting to the hospital. Fortunately, her, along with her unborn child, did survive. But when she arrived at the hospital, she had a severed jugular vein, 2 collapsed lungs, a laceration in her kidney, and severed tendons in her knees and thumbs from fighting this guy off. And so it was very incredible that she survived this at all. She was able to tell the police that he drove a Jeep Wagoner and that it was a brown gold color, and that this guy was probably about 35 to 40 years old and pretty average size, about 150, 60 pounds. So not really like a huge dude, and that he had blonde hair. And she worked with a sketch artist to get this composite sketch out. But unfortunately, he kind of just looks like every dude. The description she was able to give, while she was able to remember a lot for the things she had to go through, unfortunately, for a sketch, it's still pretty general, and so they weren't really able to narrow it down too much more based on this sketch. They did release it to the public, and there was hopes that maybe this would lead to him being caught. In June of 1989, another decomposed body was found in Warwick, Massachusetts, less than a mile from the New Hampshire border. So again, this is all happening still in the same area, even though he's crossing state lines. This woman was unidentified for so many years. It actually wasn't until last year in 2024 that she was identified as 65-year-old Constance Bassignani, and she had been stabbed and dismembered. And it sounds like her husband was a person of interest in her case, and maybe still is, but there's a lot of belief that she was actually a victim of the Valley Killer and that the husband is completely innocent. And you can go look online, there's a ton of discourse about this. On July 15th of 1989, so the next month, 14-year-old Carrie Moss left her parents' house in Boston, New Hampshire, and she was headed to a friend's house, but again never arrived. And she was missing for 2 years before her remains were discovered nearby in 1991. They haven't been able to fully establish a conclusive cause of death, but they are thinking homicide. It is strongly believed that she was a victim of his as well. Unfortunately, throughout this entire investigation, over the years of them looking for this guy, died, there was really no suspects. Again, they maybe thought that they had a lead in 1 or 2 of the victims' cases, and they had that composite sketch, but there's never a time where they had a real suspect. They were never able to name anyone. They didn't really have many people of interest. Again, there's very little to go off of in all of these crimes. And so it wasn't until 2006, a private investigator and Jane Borowski made a public statement saying that they think they have a suspicion of who might have been Jane's attacker. And they say that they think that it might have been a guy named Michael Nicolau. Michael had, in 2005, so the year before, he had killed his estranged wife and then his stepdaughter before killing himself. Michael was already deceased when they said that they thought he might have been the guy that attacked her, but there is some suspicion that he was the serial killer. Eventually, years later, Jane said that she no longer thought that he was her attacker. So there's a lot of mixed opinions on if he was the serial killer or not. The other really common theory that I saw online is that some people thought that maybe Gary Schaefer, he was another serial killer kind of active in the same area, more so Vermont, but it would make sense if he was active in Vermont and New Hampshire together. Some people think he actually might have been the Valley Killer and that all of this was related to one person and that they just weren't connecting all of the crimes. But a lot of people don't think that this is true. I'm not really convinced that he's the Valley Killer, but it is an interesting theory, and I wouldn't be shocked if maybe 1 or 2 of the victims were his, or if maybe a couple of Gary's victims were the Valley Killers and they had no idea. We know that the Valley Killer had over 7 victims. Again, I listed off many more that are pretty strongly believed to be his, just never officially confirmed. Again, I just think it's so terrifying that this guy could just be out there somewhere living his life and we have no idea that he did all of these. The likelihood is that he probably was incarcerated for something else, died, got injured. Something would have probably happened to make him stop killing. We think he stopped killing. He also could have just moved and been active somewhere else or changed his MO. So we really just don't know. That is it for the state of New Hampshire. I have multiple videos coming out this week for this series, so stay tuned and then comment what states you want to see next. I try really hard to do the states that are commented about the most first. If you comment a state, it's more likely to get done faster. I am going to do all 50 states eventually. It's just going to take some time. Again, if you comment the ones you want to see, it's more likely to happen sooner.